January 1945, a tank assembly area near Arlon, Belgium. The air is a thick wall of freezing fog and the smell of burnt diesel. Under the hull of a Sherman tank, a mechanic wipes grease from a cracked transmission casing. He looks at his watch. He looks at the iron gears inside the machine. He knows this steel will shatter within 10 miles. He writes a warning on a maintenance card and wires it to the driver's hatch. Moments later, a captain walks over. He does not look at the gears. He does not talk to the mechanic. He rips the card off the tank and throws it into the mud. He orders the engine started. He believes his will is stronger than the laws of physics. It is a choice that will cost lives before the sun sets. This is what happened when a commander ignored the man who kept him moving. This is the story of a commander who thought he knew more than his mechanic, only to watch his pride burn on a Belgian road. It is a story of how General Patton handled a leader who traded the lives of his men for 30 minutes of aggressive posturing. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the cost of pride in a war that punished it. Technician 4th grade Russell Adams was 26 years old. He came from the industrial heart of Akron, Ohio. Before the war, he had spent his days in a machine shop, learning the language of gears and the tolerance of steel. He had served 20 months in the grease and mud of the European theater, keeping the tanks of the Third Army moving through dust and snow. He was a man who lived in the details. He could hear a chipped tooth in a transmission from 50 yards away. He knew that a machine didn't care about a commander's schedule. It only cared about its own mechanical limits. To Adams, a tank wasn't just a weapon, it was a life support system for 5 men. He had seen what happened when those systems failed in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had buried friends because a fuel pump gave out, or a track pin snapped. He took his responsibility personally, and the grease under his fingernails was a badge of a different kind of service. Captain Dennis Cross was 30 years old, and hailed from Fort Worth, Texas. He was a company commander who believed that war was won by sheer aggression, and that anything slowing him down was a form of cowardice. He kept his boots polished and his uniform tailored, even in the slush of a Belgian winter. To Cross, mechanics were not essential specialists. They were men who found problems that didn't exist. He viewed every maintenance report as a personal insult to his leadership. He maintained a private notebook where he recorded every time he ignored a maintenance hold, presenting these instances to his battalion commander as proof of his relentless drive. He believed that a tank was a tool to be used until it broke, and that a mechanic's caution was merely a lack of nerve. He didn't see the machines as fragile. He saw them as extensions of his own ego. On that cold morning in January, he looked at Adams as a nuisance to be brushed aside, convinced that his command authority could override the physical reality of a grinding transmission. The Ardennes offensive had turned the Belgian countryside into a graveyard of frozen steel. By January 1945, the German counterattack had been blunted, but the Allied push back into the Reich was a grinding, agonizing struggle against both a desperate enemy and a brutal winter. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Every replacement part had to travel hundreds of miles over icy, shell-pocked roads. Every gallon of fuel was a precious commodity. In this environment, the reliability of a vehicle was not just a matter of logistics. It was the difference between life and death. Many officers across the front were beginning to feel the immense pressure of the clock. They knew the war was entering its final act, and the desire to finish the job often led to a dangerous impatience. Higher command demanded speed. They demanded results. This pressure trickled down to company commanders who began to see their equipment as invincible icons rather than mechanical objects subject to wear and tear. In some units, the technical advice of the motor pool was being drowned out by the roar of the engines and the shouting of orders. If maintenance schedules were being shortened or ignored entirely in the name of tactical momentum, it was a climate where a man like Captain Cross could thrive, masquerading his recklessness as a superior offensive spirit. The division was preparing for a push toward Arlon, and the operational tempo left no room for caution in the eyes of those who didn't have to turn the wrenches themselves. The morning air was thick with the tension of the coming assault, a silence broken only by the rhythmic clanking of a mechanic's tools against a failing machine. In 30 minutes, that silence would vanish, replaced by the sound of a catastrophe that had been predicted to the very mile. Technician Adams climbed out from under the Sherman and stood in the path of Captain Cross. He held the greasy maintenance card in his hand like a shield. "Captain, I cannot sign off on this vehicle," Adams said. "The transmission is shot. It will not last 10 miles. Cross did not stop walking. He didn't even look at the mechanic. He looked at the line of tanks warming their engines. "We attack in 30 minutes. Technician." "That tank rolls or the crew walks. Get out of the way." Adams stepped forward anyway. "Sir, you don't understand. It is a textbook failure. The gears are grinding themselves into dust. If it seizes on the road, it will block the entire column. You are risking the lives of 5 men for a repair that takes 2 hours. Cross finally stopped. He turned and leaned into the mechanic's space. He was smiling, but his eyes were cold. "You mechanics are all the same. You find problems that don't exist because you're afraid of the front. You want 2 hours so you can sit in the rear and drink coffee while my men do the real work. I don't care about your sounds or your feelings. I care about firepower." Adams felt the heat rising in his face. "It is not a feeling, sir. It is physics. Look at the metal shavings in this oil." Cross reached out and snatched the maintenance card from Adams's hand. He ripped it into 4 pieces and let them flutter into the slush. "My authority overrides your wrench, Adams. This tank is moving. If it breaks, I'll have you court-martialed for sabotage. Now get back to your hole." Adams watched him walk away. He saw the captain climb into his own jeep and signal the advance. The mechanic turned to the tank crew. They were young kids from Pennsylvania and New York. They had heard the whole thing. They looked at the tank and then back at Adams. He couldn't tell them to disobey a direct order. He just shook his head. 6 miles later, the prediction came true. The Sherman was leading the way up a narrow, steep corridor when the transmission finally shattered. The sound was like a cannon blast inside the hull. The treads locked instantly. The tank slid sideways, its heavy rear swinging out to perfectly obstruct the path. 2 tanks following behind slammed on their brakes, trapped between a sheer rock wall and a steep drop. They were sitting ducks. The German anti-tank crew in the tree line didn't miss. The first shell hit the stalled Sherman's fuel neck. The second hit the tank, trapped behind it. 3 men never made it out of the hatches. The report of the disaster and the mechanic's torn warning reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. The 4-star Jeep roared into the assembly area less than an hour after the smoke had cleared from the road. General Patton did not wait for his driver to open the door. He stepped out into the slush, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting against the dull gray of the Belgian winter. The entire camp went silent. There was no shouting, no fanfare, just the heavy, rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen gravel. Patton walked straight to the command tent where Captain Cross stood with his head down. The general held a muddy, crumpled piece of paper in his gloved hand. He didn't look at the maps on the table. He looked only at the Captain Cross. "Did you receive a maintenance report on the lead tank this morning?" Patton's voice was low, vibrating with a controlled, dangerous energy. "Yes, General," Cross replied, his voice cracking. "And did that report state the vehicle was unfit for combat?" Patton asked, stepping closer until he could see the polish on the captain's boots. "It did, sir, but we had an objective to hit. I couldn't allow a mechanic to dictate my timeline." Patton held up the torn card. "This mechanic said the tank would fail in 10 miles. It failed in 6. Tell me, Captain, was your timeline more accurate than his wrench?" Cross remained silent, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Patton's shoulder. Patton threw the torn card onto the map table, right over the Arlon objective. "You thought you were being aggressive, Captain. You thought you were showing leadership by ignoring a man who knows more about steel than you do about common sense. You didn't gain 30 minutes. You lost 3 men. You lost a $60,000 machine. You blocked a road and nearly lost an entire platoon because you were too proud to listen to a technician 4th grade. A 2-hour repair costs me 2 hours of progress. A destroyed tank costs me a crew and a vehicle I cannot replace for a month. You treated your mechanic like a nuisance when he was the only man trying to save your mission. You think the stars on my shoulders mean I can ignore the laws of physics? They don't, and neither does your rank. You believed you were the most important man in that assembly area, but the most important man was the one under the hull with the grease on his face. He told you the truth, and you tore it up. Now I have 3 families who will receive telegrams because you wanted to be a hero on paper. You have a choice. You can stay here and explain to the remaining crews why their lives are worth less than your ego. Or, you can follow my orders and accept that in this army, the mechanic is the man who makes the attack possible. You are relieved of command. Pack your gear. Either you learn to respect the men who keep us moving, or you can find a way home on foot. Cross did not move. He stood paralyzed as the reality of his ruined career settled over him. Patton turned on his heel without waiting for us a salute. The punishment was as public as the original insult. On Patton's direct order, the removal of Captain Cross from his post was not handled behind closed doors or with a quiet transfer to a desk. Instead, the disgraced officer was forced to stand in the freezing slush of the assembly area while his gear was stripped from his vehicle. Every soldier in the company was ordered to assemble and watch. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their breath blooming like white ghosts in the winter air. Technician Adams was ordered to stand at the front. He watched as the captain's personal effects were tossed into the mud, the very same mud where the torn maintenance card had landed earlier that morning. The air smelled of wood smoke and the lingering, metallic scent of the heavy recovery vehicles that had just returned from the road. The only sound was the rhythmic clinking of tools as a new mechanic began the repairs. Cross had refused. The soldiers watched the captain walk toward a waiting transport truck, his head bowed, his polished boots now caked in the thick Belgian filth. There was no cheering, only a heavy, sobering realization. The men realized that their safety was no longer at the mercy of a commander's vanity. They saw that the man with the wrench was now the most protected man in the unit. The sight of the empty command jeep and the mechanic back at work under the hull sent a message that resonated far louder than any speech. The war would continue, but the era of the arrogant amateur was over. Russell Adams returned to Akron in the fall of 1945. He didn't talk much about the war, but he opened a small automotive repair shop on the edge of town. He worked there for 40 years, and every man in the county knew that if Russell Adams told you a part was going to fail, you didn't turn the key. He kept a small, framed piece of a muddy maintenance card in his office, though he never explained its significance to his customers. He died in 1988, surrounded by a family that knew him as a man of quiet integrity and steady hands. He never forgot the 3 boys from his unit who stayed behind in the Ardennes, and he spent the rest of his life ensuring that every machine he touched was as safe as human hands could make it. Dennis Cross lived a much different life. After his relief, he was shuffled into a series of rear-echelon administrative roles. He never saw combat again. He returned to Texas in 1946 and tried to resume his climb up the social and business ladders of Fort Worth, but the stain of his relief followed him in the small, tight-knit circles of veteran officers. He remained a bitter man, often writing letters to military journals claiming that the push toward Arlon had been compromised by a lack of aggressive leadership and bureaucratic interference. He died in 1972, still maintaining that he had been the victim of a general's temper rather than his own technical ignorance. General Patton mentioned the incident only once in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that a commander who does not respect the tools of his trade is no better than a carpenter who blames his hammer for a crooked house. He kept the report of the incident in a personal file labeled Lessons, noting that the most dangerous enemy an army faces is often the arrogance of its own officers. He believed until his final day that the man with the wrench was the foundation upon which every victory was built. Some historians have argued that Patton's decision to relieve a combat commander in the middle of a major offensive was an act of impulsiveness that risked unit cohesion during a critical window. They suggest that a private reprimand or a post-battle review would have preserved the chain of command without causing the public humiliation of a sitting officer. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that the incident served as a vital corrective measure for an army that had become dangerously cavalier with its limited resources. They point to the immediate improvement in maintenance readiness across the Third Army as proof of the verdict's effectiveness. What is certain is that the directive issued after the Arlon breakdown became a cornerstone of armored doctrine, ensuring that the technical expertise of the mechanic was never again sacrificed for the sake of a commander's ego. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply issued a formal reprimand? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the cost of pride in a war that punished it, make sure you subscribe.